Welcome. Welcome to the Black Table. My name is Greg Carr. I am a proud member of the Black Star Network. I teach at Howard University in the Department of Afro-American Studies. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the Howard University School of Law. And most importantly, I am a listener, a teacher, and one more member of our continuing struggle to try to think through and understand how to create a better society. And so this program, The Black Table, is dedicated to that purpose. We are about reframing the way we think about topics and ideas and concepts and issues that we think we know about, but we want to create new spaces to think differently about how to resolve some of the issues that face us in contemporary society. We want to apply that critical lens to topics across the full range. And we want to leave everybody thinking, how can we be better prepared to act? Today, we are very, very excited in our inaugural conversation to welcome into the conversation some very important thinkers in an intergenerational dialogue around a topic that has become very, very hot these days. The topic is our historically Black colleges and universities. I'm a product of an HBCU, Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee. And I can say very easily that without that faculty at Tennessee State University, Jamie Williams, McDonald Williams, Lois McDougall, William Dury Cox, Hoyt King, and so many others, names that you might not know, but names that as you are listening, you can slot in the names of the folks who taught you K-12, taught you in undergraduate and graduate school and so forth. Without those people, I wouldn't be here at the center of this conversation we're going to have today around the Black Table. And so we thought that this initial conversation we would launch, would help us launch the Black Table, would be one that would be important to center some voices that represent the best of the thinking tradition around the topic of the past, present, and future of HBCUs, of historically Black colleges and universities. And so to do that, I'm going to introduce three people, two longtime intellectuals, partners in this intellectual work, not only around the topic of historically Black colleges, universities, but the broader concept of how we think Black, act Black, do Black across the range. And then we're going to introduce a brother who, like myself, is in that following generation, who apprenticed with these master teachers and their colleagues, and who have taken up the challenge that they laid out for us to continue this work of really working through what we're going to talk about today in the context of HBCUs, the concept of the Black University. So first we have Dr. Andrew Billingsley and Amy Tate Billingsley. Dr. Andrew Billingsley is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of South Carolina Institute for Family and Society. But before that, he held a number of academic appointments. He was the president of Morgan State University in Baltimore. And also before that, he was the vice president for academic affairs at Howard University when he left the University of California, Berkeley to come east to help Howard University become the Black University. We're going to get into that whole conversation in a minute. Dr. Billingsley is a highly regarded author. Many of you have probably heard of his work. His probably best known work is a book called Black Families in White America. Climbing Jacob's Ladder, another of his texts, Children of the Storm, Mighty Like a River, The Black Church and Social Reform. One of his more recent works is his book, Yearning to Breathe Free, Robert Smalls in South Carolina and His Family. And I want to highlight this particular book because this book is hot off the press and you need to get this book immediately. This is Andrew Billingsley, Scholar and Institution Builder, Essays and Tributes, edited by his friend Charles Jorman, where he collects a number of folk who gathered for his 90th birthday celebration when he was and remains in the position of the John and Eula Cleveland Chair in Afro-American Studies at Howard University. We asked him to come back and he graciously agreed. And at his 90th birthday symposium, he convened, along with his team, a really constellation of scholars to talk about how they tried to build, and in fact did build, the Black University in the 1970s and 80s. Sitting there with him, is his partner, Amy Tate Billingsley. This sister is a towering intellectual out of Chicago, Illinois, raised in Chicago, and went off to got a degree from the University of Chicago, and then went to the Ohio State University, and then the University of Baltimore. Has traveled the world, working very early in her intellectual work with the Republic of Senegal and Operations Crossroads. Came back, worked at Harvard for a while at the Center for Research and Study of Personality, and then she partnered up with Dr. Billingsley. At the time, he was at Brandeis as a student, and they began their intellectual work together. She contributed mightily to Black families in white America, as I mentioned, and we also she then began, when they moved out west to California. She got involved in politics, helping get Tom Bradley elected mayor of Atlanta. I'm sorry, mayor of Los Angeles. I got ahead of myself because she helped Andrew Young win his congressional seat in Atlanta. And from there, she has worked in a number of roles, including with the Clinton administration as a White House public liaison. She worked as a program manager for the White House Initiative on HBCUs, and also worked with Secretary Alexis Herman, Secretary of Labor. A couple of other things. She was a founder of Black Women's Agenda, and has served on the National Black MBA Association. And we're going to talk a lot more about her contemporary work. She's worked as a consultant for a number of institutions, including the History Makers, which is a very important entity. If you don't know about the History Makers out of Chicago, you really need to know. Maybe say some more about that, Sister Amy, in a moment. And we will be joined, so welcome, Sister Amy, and we're going to be joined in intergenerational dialogue with one of our brothers who's one of my age mates, and that's Dr. Jelani Favors. Dr. Jelani Favors, my brother. In fact, I'll say this before I say anything else. If you have not gotten this book, you need to get it. It's called Shelter in a Time of Storm. I have my hardback copy is in the other room, but I had, you can get that as an ebook format as well. How Black colleges fostered generations of leadership and activism. This book really sets the framework in so many ways for what we'll be talking about today. Dr. Favors is a native of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and went to North Carolina A&T. He has circled through a number of institutions. He went to graduate school and taught at Ohio State University, where he got a master's in African American studies and a doctorate in history. Came through Morgan State. It's going to be interesting. We had this conversation today, Jelani, with Dr. Billingsley, who used to run Georgia State. I have a feeling if Dr. Billingsley had been the president of Morgan State, you'd probably still be there. He wouldn't let you get away. But he cycled through several institutions before. This is very exciting, everyone. In late 2021, September 2021, the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Aggie Pride, brought him home to occupy a chair, a distinguished chair named for Professor Fry, Henry E. Fry, who's an American judge, politician, served as the first African-American Chief Justice of North Carolina Supreme Court. And I'm very excited today because, in addition, by the way, his book, Shelter in Time of Storm, won the 2020 Stone Book Award. That is a prize that is presented by the Museum of African American History in Boston. And it's very important as well. He also won the Lillian Smith Book Award. The Southern Regional Council and the University of Georgia Library selected Shelter in Time of Storm. And there are a number of other things we could talk about, and we're going to get right into it now. But I thought that it's very important for us to start with that introduction at the beginning of this first convening of the Black Table, so that folk understand that one of our other objectives is to bring into conversation some of the most important thinkers and actors that we can identify and recruit into the conversation, with an emphasis on folks who you might not be as aware of as you should be aware of, who don't often get called on as much as they should in white-facing media. I'd call it mainstream, but this is the mainstream. This is our mainstream. So with that in mind, I want to bring everybody back into the conversation and start with a question around the history of HBCUs. And I'd like to frame it a little bit, ask you all about the history of HBCUs, and perhaps we'll start with you, Professor Favors. I want to talk a little bit, ask you maybe to frame it in terms of a recent article. This is an article that appeared in the summer 2021 issue of The Point, which is a journal. Dr. Favors published an article called The Second Curriculum, where he opens that conversation about HBCUs, and the whole issue, the article is about HBCUs, but he talks about one of his professors, Wayman McLaughlin. And Dr. Favors, if you don't mind helping us, when we say that when we say HBCU, when we say historically Black college and university, for folks who either think they know or may not know much at all, what is an HBCU? And give us some of the history of HBCUs in terms of their importance, what the role of faculty, and what they really do and have done in the past.
Well, first of all, again, thank you so much, Greg, for inviting me to be with you here today. It is an absolute, I'm usually honored to be with you. I'm even more honored to share the stage with the Billingsley. So it is just an absolute honor to join you on what is today the second day of Kwanzaa, Habari Gani. And of course, the response to that today is Kuji Chakalia, right? And Kuji Chakalia emphasizes the idea of self-determination. Right. And so what we clearly understand about the legacy of HBCUs is that they were never really about what white folks could do on behalf of Black people. Right. That's always been sort of the general assumption, is that, through white philanthropy and white benefactors, that these institutions developed and emerged in the shadows of slavery. And in doing so, they shaped generations of young Black folks to fall in line with the expectations of a Jim Crow society. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was always about how Black folks shaped and carved out these spaces to meet their needs. And emerging out of slavery, even before slavery ends in 1865, beginning in 1837 with the founding of the Institute for Colored Youth, which would later go on to become Cheyney State University, as well as those other two institutions that emerged in the midst of the antebellum era, Wilberforce, as well as Lincoln University. These institutions and spaces were directly linked with the freedom dreams of Black folks. How could they use these spaces to empower generations of young African Americans to reject the principles of white supremacy, which tried to teach the idea that Black folks had no dignity, had no humanity, had no culture, had no history, and immediately out the gate, there's a different blueprint that's going to emerge within these institutions, spaces where, again, young Black folks, their freedom dreams can soar unimpeded. They can see themselves as a continuation of the Black liberation struggle. They can use their voices, their talents, their skills to speak towards the idea of deconstructing white supremacy, of deconstructing Jim Crow, and building, as you said earlier, Greg, a better and more tolerant and more just society. And that is radically different. You mentioned the essay that I wrote for The Point magazine. I was asked to write that essay, and the theme was, what is the university for? And what is very clear is that, again, beginning in 1837, within the academic circles, HBCUs are going to be radically different spaces than their PWI counterparts. Again, they will be spaces which will train the future generations of young activists, engaged citizens who, again, use their talents, their skills, their abilities to think about how they could build a more tolerant and more inclusive society. And again, that is so radically different than what PWIs were doing during that same time. Again, we're talking about the antebellum era where, they were studying skull sizes and the inferiority of Black folks and referring to Africa as the dark continent. Meanwhile, again, Black folks are exposed to what I refer to as the second curriculum, which emphasized race consciousness, idealism, and cultural nationalism. How do we build, again, in the spirit of self-determination, how do we build spaces and build movements which will push Black folks forward? And that is, again, radically different from what PWIs were doing. And this is why HBCUs are so important. It's always been about family, about belonging, about making people feel as though they were part of something bigger than themselves. You mentioned your maturation at Tennessee State University. I lead that article off in The Point discussing and talking about my ancestors, my professors, who, as one of my dissertation advisors, Dr. Hassan Jeffries, liked to say, as he was reading my earlier work in this area, it's almost as if there was a laying on of hands tradition, like in the tradition of the Black church, right? Of I'm gonna pass on a mission and a purpose to you. That's what people like Dr. Wayman McLaughlin did for me. And he, of course, had been impacted in that same way as a former student at Virginia Union University. So this is that legacy of passing on that torch of racial responsibility, of building a better society, of understanding your purpose. And I am thankful to be a benefactor of that. And I am even more thankful that now I have the opportunity to return to my alma mater and continue in that same tradition, passing on that legacy and that charge, that mission to current generations of young Black students.
Thank you, Jelani. This is, man, it's so powerful. You know, you had a couple of, as you were talking, I'm reflecting on something you wrote, several things you wrote in the article that you referred to, and you raised something so powerful, brother, when you said that questioning and seeking to amend the contradictions in American society became a major byproduct of Black education. And I thought that you're crafting, you're narrating that struggle as a byproduct rather than the center or purpose of those institutions was very powerful. As we get ready to bring the Billingsleys into the conversation, I want to ask you about the importance of faculty, because I mean, you've talked about it already, and you mentioned, of course, Brother McLaughlin, Dr. McLaughlin, Professor McLaughlin, who taught your parents, which I thought was striking, very striking. And then tended to you in a 40-year career that included many HBCUs. And of course, his Jegnas, his mentors at Virginia Union, it made me think, of course, of Jeremiah Wright Sr., the father of Jeremiah Wright Jr., who was the first in his family to go to college, whose father sent him to Virginia Union with 25 cents, as Reverend Wright tells the story, to go, and it altered the trajectory of his entire family. And not just his family, but our people. And one of the things that today I know we will talk about in a great deal is how that second curriculum, as you described it, you have named it and given voice to something that we all experienced, including, of course, our friend Hassan Jeffries, who came out of Morehouse, right? Mm-hmm. That second curriculum, there was a moment that you emphasized, not only in Shelter in the Time of Storm, your book, but that you emphasize in this article, where there was a push by students primarily to make that second curriculum the first curriculum. Could you say a little bit about that? And then we'll bring in perhaps the single most knowledgeable from experience living authority in the world on that attempt. But could you say a little bit about what was that about, trying to make the second curriculum that you talk about the first?
Well, I mean, a lot of it was just simply about interrogating these critical and vitally important spaces at the apex of the Black Power era, where emphasis was increasingly being put on the second curriculum, right? The idea of racial consciousness and cultural nationalism. And Black folks were using that moment, that historical crossroads, to think about how they could even intensify that even more without apology. Much of the second curriculum, much of the work of the second curriculum was often done in the shadows. It was often done in these spaces that were carved out. And these are all, again, critically important and vital spaces. Office hours with students, where teaching, and lecturing at these institutions, where a professor and teacher may be feeling the heat, especially if you taught at a place like Tennessee State University or Florida A&M or Alabama State University, may be feeling the heat from white state legislators who control the purse strings of these institutions, who were vehemently opposed to anything radical, any essence of dissent emerging on these campuses. but it's something powerful about, again, that space, about a teacher being able to close their classroom door and to begin having these conversations. My friend Jarvis Givens at Harvard University just produced an incredible book on Carter G. Woodson. And when you think about the legacy of Carter G. Woodson and the work that he was doing, HBCUs are so incredibly vital to that. Yes, you have the legacy of Black educators in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, but all of these teachers were being trained at HBCUs, right? And so that work began in terms of their preparation, in terms of understanding how to navigate these often hostile spaces. It began within the spaces of Black colleges. And so when you look at the 1960s, so many frustrated young Black activists were saying, look, we don't want to work out of the shadows anymore. This should be forthright. It should be singular. It should be, we should, as they said at Howard University, we should move toward a Black university, right? And so there was so much questioning and so much interrogation around that idea about how do we make these institutions even more important and central to the Black liberation struggle. And that brought out people like Dr. Billingsley and so many other folks associated with these institutions who try to elevate that conversation, but also push these institutions closer towards the freedom dreams of all Black folks, the masses of Black folks, not just the Black middle class, not just the Black working class. How do we have an honest conversation about the failures and the trappings of American capitalism and white supremacy as it is deeply fortified within every institution within the United States of America? And this is what young activists were calling for and demanding. And it was a challenge for administrators and for educators at these institutions to begin having some of those hard conversations about how do we make these institutions and these spaces more relevant and central to the freedom dreams of all Black people.
Appreciate you, brother. An unresolved conflict and an unresolved challenge, it seems to me, and you've written about and talked about, and those of us who paid particularly attention to W.E.B. Du Bois's discussion of HBCUs and the role of Black universities in this continuous work that we have to do. We've paid particular attention to his commencement speeches, his discussions with educators around this topic. And there was one in particular there nearby Johnson C. Smith University, where he and his wife, Shirley Graham, went down to a meeting of the social scientists, the Black social studies, actually teachers, K-12 and university. And he gave a talk, Whither Now and Why, where he says these laws are going to change. And then you're going to have to ask yourself, what then is the function and purpose of Black teachers and Black education in a society where the laws have changed, but you haven't decided what you're going to be? And this, of course, is a theme that he takes up in the early 20th century at Fisk and at Hampton, at Howard, and many other places, Knoxville College. And Du Bois, of course, tries with the Atlanta University Studies to establish maybe a foundation for what a Black university might be. But as you were talking, Jelani, it just resonates so deeply that you say that a lot of this work had to take place in the shadows. And even taking place in the shadows, how it informed and shifted. I mean, you wrote about, for example, what happened with Professor Higgins, Rodney Higgins at Southern University, when the president of Southern, Felton Clark, brought him down there and to build that political science department. And then we get Jewel Prestage, we get Mac Jones and the Atlanta University School. And so folks now might see an Adolph Reed Jr., but they may not know about Adolph Reed Sr. and the connection to political science. So as you were talking and really leading us through this unresolved tension about what we can do with these HBCUs, and it really does bring a fundamental question that we're going to ask in a second, the Billingsleys, to begin to approach, as to what was achieved in the attempt to make that second curriculum the first curriculum, and what maybe are the implications going forward in terms of the current state of HBCUs. And you mentioned your brother Jarvis Givens, and read Fugitive Pedagogy, an excellent book. And at the same time, I said to myself, it's not fugitive. It was not fugitive to those who were undertaking it. And with all due respect to Professor Givens at Harvard and Professor Jeffries at Ohio State, we made a deliberate choice to come into Black college spaces and teach, research, work, serve. And that is because I think those of us who did that, you, myself, and so many others, whose names and whose work isn't featured in these white stream spaces necessarily. We did that because we know that we not only owe a debt, but we're still struggling to resolve those fundamental contradictions, and class does play such a central role. And brother, everyone watching, this is what the Black Table is about. We again, a different lens, another grounding, and it's probably going to resonate with folks saying, finally, we had a place where we had these conversations. So we're going to take a moment and pause. And when we come back, we're going to ask two of our towering elders in this long arc of intellectual work and institution building, particularly in Black spaces, Andrew and Amy Billingsley, to help us push a little bit further into this question of the history of HBCUs, particularly given their lens coming into that work during the Black Power movement, the Black Studies movement, and how they move to transform these institutions so that second curriculum Dr. Favors is talking about can come out of the shadows and perhaps occupy center stage. So back in a moment.
Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punches!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table. I'm Greg Carr. And when we paused, Dr. Jelani Favors at North Carolina A&T really laid the foundation for our conversation today by helping us understand not only the history of HBCUs, but the central role that historically Black colleges have played and the central role of faculty at historically Black colleges, the central role they have played in shaping generations of young Black people, in conducting research, in helping to shape the intellectual thrust of Black community, and not only doing all that, but also as a byproduct, as he writes, helping to transform the American project, the American experiment, one that never imagined that people of African descent would be doing any of what we're doing today. And with that in mind, we're going to now invite into the conversation two people who we are very excited about not only having, but helping us understand um, helping us understand how this process unfolded during and in the wake of the period that Jelani Favors just laid out for us, which was the late 1960s, early 1970s, when students, faculties, communities around the United States at HBCUs rose to contest not only the inequities in American society, but to contest the very idea of what HBCUs should be doing to uplift, improve, prepare Black communities, not only in the United States, but around the world. So we're going to invite Dr. Andrew Billingsley, Professor Amy Billingsley into this conversation. And as we do, want to evoke Professor Billingsley, Professor Andrew Billingsley, an article that was just published in the fall 2021 issue of the Black Scholar. This article was introduced by and annotated by our sister, another of our colleagues at Howard University in the Department of African American Studies, Dr. Amy Yoboah, Howard University and the Challenge of the Black University. This was a conversation that we had with you, Dr. Billingsley, Andrew Billingsley, around what in the world you all were trying to accomplish in the late 1960s and early 1970s by converting in some ways Howard University to an example, not of the only Black university, but one of the Black universities. And so we're going to continue in the first topic in terms of the history of HBCUs, but we want to do it, if you all don't mind, in a kind of free-flowing way where you all help us understand how you were recruited from the West Coast with the idea that you were going to go to a Black institution that was literally being built from the ground up, namely the Institute of the Black World, the great Vincent Harding and others. And then you got a phone call from a young college president who had just been recruited himself out of North Carolina, where Professor Favors is, of course, James Cheek at Shaw, to come to Howard University and answer the call to build a Black university. And then he turned the keys over to you all, and you went and recruited dozens, over 100 faculty members, some of whose names we know, Joyce Ladner and Ron Walters, to be the kind of faculty that trained Jelani and I. So if you two wouldn't mind taking a few minutes, could you walk us through what was going through y'all's minds in the late 60s as y'all were sitting there at Berkeley? And then what were you trying to accomplish at that moment in time and space? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brother Greg, for that kind introduction. Greg, everybody needs to know, is my boss at Howard University. He brought me back to Howard when I was still down in South Carolina. But to get into your question, let me first say a couple of things about my background, how I got to Howard. I was born in Marion, Alabama in 1926 in a poor family. We survived the Depression. And then I went to the Army, U.S. Army for a couple of years. And then because of the Army experience, I got something called the GI Bill of Rights. Otherwise, I would not have been able to go to college. So I went to college. And where did I go? I went to one of the premier Black colleges, Hampton. It was called Hampton Institute at the time. And so I've kept in touch with that. What I got at Hampton was a head start, not only into higher education, but into Black higher education. And I went on from one school to another until I finally got a job teaching at the University of California in Berkeley. Now, the Berkeley experience in the 70s was still almost an all-white university, except after the death of Dr. King, they began to admit a few Black students. And unfortunately for them, when the Black students came, the 5 or 6 Black students came with a message. They said, let's create a new Black division within this white university. As you can imagine, that was very, very hard to do and very much opposed to by the establishment of that university. But anyhow, with their leadership, I was brought into the office of the chancellor to help them build that Black Studies program, and it succeeded wonderfully, among one of the first in the country. And so that's how I got my start as an educator, as a Black educator, lifting up the Black experience. When I look at the Black college experience from Howard, looking backward, and from Howard looking forward, the Black institution college is a unique institution. It is especially unique for Black students. For when Black students step into a Black college or university, they experience something that they had only experienced before in the Black church. That is, they were surrounded by Black excellence and Black devotion to our people. And this was a unique experience for those students and for the teachers as well in those institutions. So when she came to Howard, he came because the students at Howard, as they had begun doing all around the country, began to demand change. They began to demand more Black education, more Black courses, more Black faculty. And although Howard was on his way there, Howard was sort of standing still in the 1970s. And so when she came, he came with the mission of actually changing the university, building on the university, making it what he called an institution of excellence by anybody's measure. So by Black, we did not mean anything inferior. We meant something superior to what they had been getting before. And so that's what we set out to do in the 1970s. I must say that the students at Howard University at that time, and indeed in most Black colleges and universities from that time until now, get a unique experience. First of all, they're surrounded by Black excellence for the first time. All around them are Black scholars, Black administrators, Black workers, and they are embroiled in this ocean of Black excellence. And after a few years in that kind of institution, they are therefore trained to go on and build on that excellence and lift other people up. We came to Howard with the idea of teaching students to climb the ladder, but also to look back and lift as they climb, make sure that they pave the way for other people to move ahead as well. And so President Cheek used to say, we strive for excellence. We strive for excellence by anybody's measure, and we strive for Black excellence, standing on the shoulders of those ancestors that have gone before us. And at Howard, we stood on the shoulders of those who came before us and built an institution that, as she used to say, excellent by anybody's measure. And one of the things that struck me when I came in '70 to Howard is, although Howard was called a university, except for the medical school and the law school, it did not produce many high-level professionals. There were no PhD programs, for example, in the social sciences, the humanities, the arts. And for example, although there were some very distinguished Black PhDs, like E. Franklin Frazier, Ralph Bunche, and so on, they got their PhDs somewhere else. They didn't get them at Howard. There were no PhDs being offered in those fields. So my job, according to President Cheek, was to develop doctoral programs and build on the strong undergraduate programs that had existed at Howard for some time. And so we set about, as Greg says, we set about building programs and institutes and teaching PhD scholars. I was told recently by the archivist at Howard that Howard University still produces more Black PhDs than any other single university in the country or in the world. So starting from a low level, we moved it forward step by step into the realm of high levels of excellence. I must also say, and introducing Amy, I must say that the Black College has been united with the Black Church. The Black Church and the Black College are the premier institutions in the Black community that have been stepping stones for Black people the world over. Amy might be able to tell you a little bit about her Black church, which is still striving to move mountains. Amy?
We belong to a church in Alexandria called the Alfred Street Baptist Church. And Alfred Street has every year, founded by Wilma Roscoe, who used to be at NAFIO, a Black College fair every year that has about 70 HBCUs and has, hundreds, I guess the last count is probably about 1 million, well, maybe not 1 million, maybe several 100,000 students that come through and talk with representatives of those universities and hear different programs, introducing them to Black college presidents, Black college presidents and life. So I'm very pleased to be associated with a university that does, a church that does so much. Alfred Street was founded in 1803, of course, by members that got together as a church and got together for education, emphasizing education. And they continue to do so. Recently they gave $1 million to the museum, National Museum of African American History and Culture. And they continue to do wonderful, groundbreaking things like that in the fields of religion and education.
I want to say also that our family not only worked in Black colleges and boosted Black colleges, but it became a family affair. For example, our daughter, Benita, that we're visiting down here now, went to Spelman College. Her husband, Cadillac Harris, a very distinguished football coach, went to Norfolk State College. And their daughter, Cheyenne Harris, now goes to Spelman College. So Black colleges are in our lifeblood. And while we're visiting down here, we visit a neighbor, the family Martell Perry, whose father was at Hampton with me. So he studied engineering while I studied sociology. So we're surrounded by the Black college and Black church experience.
Excellent. I want to ask you all one more question, and then we'll take a break. And we come back, Brother Jelani and I will all be in roundtable conversation and tease out some of these issues. And for those of you who may not be aware, when you heard Professor Amy Billingsley talk about NAFIO, that's the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education. Another of your longtime dear friends and colleagues, of course, the great Sam Myers, once the president of Bowie State University. He recently made transition at 101. So y'all still youngsters compared to Dr. Myers. Of course, led that institution for years, a former HBCU president. But as you all were talking, I want to ask you just very quickly, and thank you. And for those of you who, as I said, have not yet gotten Andrew Billingsley Scholar and Institution Builder, where a number of you all's colleagues, people you recruited, contributed chapters. And of course, it's published by a Black-owned publisher, the great William Paul Coates, Black Classic Press, of course, a Black institution. As you were talking about that work, developing those PhD programs, training those scholars, a couple of things came to mind. Randy Maturi, who's down there at Duke, Randy Maturi's book, Stigma and Culture, where he talks about this class issue at HBCUs, and he focuses on Howard, where his father was for many years on faculty at the medical school. And he said that the struggle at many HBCUs, and he kind of spotlights Howard in this, was to avoid what he calls last place anxiety. So he talks about Black folk coming from the Caribbean, coming from Africa, and he talks about that concentration, particularly at the medical school, where there's this kind of class division around law, around medicine, and the HBCUs, whether it be Meharry, Morehouse School of Medicine, you have that professional class. But then he says there are this other surge of Black folk who are coming to get an education, to uplift their community, who are coming from lower down in the class strata. And as you were talking, as you all were talking, one of the questions that came to mind for me, particularly since you made the connection between the HBCUs and the Black church, how did you all try to address that question of not just access to higher education, but helping us kind of break down what really has emerged since the Black Power era, the Civil Rights Black Power era, movement era, these class divisions and class tensions, particularly even at HBCUs. I mean, you all did a lot of work during those years of recruiting this faculty to really begin to focus lenses. And you mentioned Dr. Billingsley. Those of you who, when you get this book, you'll see in every area, social work, the humanities, as we heard Janine talk about a minute ago, all across the social sciences, the creation of the Howard University Press, WHUR and WHUT, radio station, television station. How did you all try to create a different vision of higher education that would have people come through and receive training, not just to improve their individual lives or their families' lives, but ultimately to kind of shape a different concept of the Black community, rather than just replicating the very highly class stratified model of white society and white universities? Did you all have any problems around class tensions as they emerged?
Not at Howard at that time. I understand before that there had been a certain amount of class tension, but you must remember that when we came to Howard in the late 60s and the 70s, it was a revolutionary time. And Black people all over the country beginning to rise up and stand on each other's shoulders. Sheik used to say to us and the students, he used to challenge the students by saying, your reach must be higher than your grasp, or what's the heaven for? In other words, he challenged the faculty and the students to move beyond whatever was ordinary, to reach for the stars. And so that's what we did. We didn't have any white model to go after. We were going to be excellent by anybody's measure. And so that pushed us on and led us on to higher heights.
Wow. That's very powerful. That is extreme. In fact, let's use that as a launching point, if you all don't mind. When we return from our break, we're going to come and talk about the present status of HBCUs. And wow, to articulate that vision of a model of excellence that doesn't take as its precedent or as its foundation external notions of excellence, but it's literally looking within, tapping within. I think it's a very powerful point of departure. And when we come back in a moment, we'll talk about the current state of HBCUs, and maybe we'll, Jelani, you and I in conversation with the Billingsleys can talk through and think through what of that thrust continues today, what we may have lost track of, and what we may have contributed to that in this moment. So back in a minute.
Black Star Network is here.
Hold no punches.
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all. All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table. Today's inaugural topic, the past, present, and future of historically Black colleges and universities. Our guests, Professor Andrew and Amy Billingsley, Professor Jelani Favors, myself, and we left off a moment ago with the Billingsleys articulating the compelling vision of excellence, service to Black communities that transcended any reliance on an external model, that drew on the long intellectual traditions of Black institutions, HBCUs, the Black church, and so many other Black institutions for the foundation for what was given voice and flower, as Dr. Andrew Billingsley says, during a revolutionary time in the 1970s in the United States and the world of the Black university. So we're going to now convene virtually what we would do in person around our Black table. We're now going to convene now a kind of bit of a conversation around the present status of HBCUs. And I'm going to ask our brother Jelani Favors, a first-rate scholar, teacher, servant who is firmly anchored in HBCUs and now occupies a named chair at his alma mater. As the Billingsleys were talking, Jelani, I'm sure a lot of stuff went through your mind, brother. So I'm just going to ask you to make some remarks, maybe ask some questions, and we're going to have a bit of a conversation there in this figure. Go ahead, brother.
I want to come back to this issue of class that you raised, because I think it's such a pressing issue. And you and I have often joked about the fact that we were products of the field Negro tradition, right?
Yes, sir.
We went to state institutions.
Yes, sir.
Tennessee State, North Carolina A&T, Florida A&M.
Yes, sir.
These were institutions which, yes, classism existed within these spaces. Colorism existed within these spaces. Paternalism, there's all these type of isms that thrive within these spaces, but they never overshadow the mission and the purpose of Black colleges, particularly as it related to questioning white supremacy and Jim Crow. But you and I were products of those spaces, and we both were trained by a man who was a product of this space as well, Dr. William Nelson Jr.
Yes, sir.
Who went on to teach at Ohio State University, one of the founders of the Black Studies program at Ohio State University. And Dr. Nelson used to always tell us in class, we would be sitting in his political science classes, and he would sometimes seem as though he was falling asleep. We're sitting here talking about this different work, and Dr. Nelson, we would wonder, like, is Dr. Nelson up? Is he listening to what we're saying? And all of a sudden, Dr. Nelson would spring to life. And one of the overarching constant questions that he would pepper us with is, what does this have to do with the liberation of Black people? Whatever it is that we were reading, whatever it is that we were discussing, he would always bring it back to, what does this have to do with the liberation of Black people? And in fact, he would ask us that so much that we began to start calling it the Nelsonian question. Right? What does this have to do with the liberation of Black people? And I think that that's the pressing and overarching issue surrounding the legacy of Black colleges, is what have they had to do with the liberation of Black people? And I think the Billingsleys have already perfectly illustrated the fact that they have meant everything to the struggle for Black liberation. So my question to Dr. Billingsley would be to discuss that transition going from Howard over to the state institution of Morgan State. I'm not sure if it was Morgan State University at the time or whether it was still Morgan College. But I would love to know what that meant for you and your career, and how you brought that purpose, that mission of channeling the energy of the Black Power era into Morgan State, and what kind of ideas and what type of new concepts did you bring to Morgan State I believe you were there in the 80s, right? 70s and 80s, you were there? Yeah. Talk about that transition a little bit, and your legacy at Morgan State, and what it had to do with the liberation of Black people.
Okay. All right. Okay. You're using that expression reminded me that Ron Walters, one of the premier scholars that I recruited to Howard, used that expression as a basis for his mission at Howard. He would challenge the students and the faculty and the administration with the question, what has this got to do with the liberation of Black people? Right. In fact, he so much believed in that as a motivating mantra that he titled one of his books, What has this got to do with the liberation of Black people? So that's Ron Walters, and that's Howard. I was attracted to come to Morgan University from Howard in 1975 because there had been a proposal in the state legislature to elevate Morgan State College to Morgan State University. That was the new idea for Maryland, a Black university. So I went there with the purpose of helping to lead that movement. And it was very hard at first. I mean, the state legislature didn't understand what a Black university was. The governor who controlled everything didn't understand what a Black university was. And some of our own people didn't understand. But with the students primarily and the faculty, we were able to chisel together the concept of a new Black university in the state of Maryland. And we made the transition from college to university in the first 3 years of my 10-year leadership. And then since that time, the institution has been building block by block, program by program on top of each other. It is now one of the largest institutions in the state, among the largest Black universities, and it has a very strong financial footing. It was a struggle when I was there to raise money from the state, but since that time, the students from the 4 Black universities hired some lawyers and sued the state for underfunding and for duplicating Black programs at white universities. And so after 3 or 4 years, they were successful. And I don't know how many millions of dollars they now have to spread among those 4 Black colleges to keep on building. And the new president of Morgan has continued the fantastic vision that we started the university with. And I would say Morgan is now among the largest Black institutions and increasingly among the strongest. We are taught to lift while we climb, and we are taught to strive for excellence, and they're doing just that 40 years after I left. Another thing I'd say about the Black colleges is that we haven't mentioned it much, but they had a very difficult beginning after the Civil War, and they have always been underfunded. They have always had to do with less, and they have always shown remarkable talent to do more with less. And one of the things we discovered at Howard, I discovered that not only did we try to raise money from the federal government and from student tuition, but while I was there and before I was there was no effort to raise funds from this alumni. And I remember some of the alumni were able to give. You know, they were doctors and lawyers and business people, but they didn't have the habit of giving funds back to the university. I'm now pleased to note that there is now a trickle, more than a trickle, of giving back. When Greg and those people and Amy gave my 90th birthday party at Howard, one of the students who came to that party gave a contribution of $2,000. Another student gave a contribution of $3,500. And that was sort of like a beginning of a new movement of alumni giving back to the universities. And now at Morgan, not only do alumni start to give, it is not yet up to where it should be, but at least 3 Black millionaires have given more than $1 million to Morgan. And the state has increased its appropriation, and the students, former students at the 4 Black colleges in Maryland, Morgan, Coppin, Morgan, UMES, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, they got together and hired some lawyers to sue the state for discriminating against the Black colleges and underfunding them and taking programs away from the Black colleges and giving them to the universities. It took 4 or 5 years to win that suit, but last year they won it, and they have hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to now be spread from the state that's not going to be spread among those 4 Black colleges. So it pays to strive, to work hard, and to believe that it's possible. And the Black colleges, along with the Black churches, are the best examples of that mantra.
Greg, if you don't mind, can I just come back?
No, please, brother, by all means.
Because again, these are just some incredible nuggets that you're delivering to us, Dr. and Mrs. The doctors, Billingsley. And in fact, I would love to hear Amy jump in on this question as well, because again, your husband has already kind of teased this out. When you look at these institutions, you're looking at legacies of Black excellence, you're looking at legacies of Black empowerment, but you're also looking at the legacy, living embodiment of segregation, right? It's very clear that these institutions have been underfunded, deliberately underfunded by years, by both the federal government, the state government, local. I mean, there's a discrepancy. When you walk on a campus like Tennessee State University and then go to University of Tennessee, Knoxville, it's very clear, right, that there has been a massive funding discrepancy and a funding gap. But we're beginning to see some templates, some blueprints being established of how these institutions can, and I would argue should, be seeking restitution and even a form of reparation through funding. Do you believe, Dr. Amy Billingsley, that is the trajectory that these institutions should be on, that every last one of them should be saying, hey, pay us what you owe us? And this has been a and I think it's great that you bring in alumni donors and alumni giving. That's critically important, but we also clearly see a massive funding gap as it relates to what the legacy of racist state legislatures have done to try to slow down the progress of these institutions. Can we see moving forward, or should we expect moving forward, other HBCUs following suit and pressing for some form of economic restitution from the state?
Absolutely. And it's very clear that HBCUs have donated to the country a very special kind of service. And the underprivileged African Americans that go to these schools have a different enlightenment that also has been extremely beneficial to the community, to the schools, and to the country. So I think it's absolutely important that these schools be funded as they should be, because they do bring such an important dimension to education, to communities, and to the country.
And as you said, Jolani, funding from all sources, funding from the federal government. I mean, the federal government should provide more than the token amount they now provide to these colleges, because the colleges, wherever they're located, contribute to the nation. And so there is a movement now to try to increase, under the Biden administration, the amount of the federal appropriation to all of these Black colleges. And that is a good move. But it's also important, I think, for the well-to-do Black graduates from these schools to contribute their fair share to building these institutions as well.
Well, y'all are really trying to tear the floorboards up on these conventional conversations on HBCUs. This is so important. Those of you all who are tuning in, this is the Black Table, particularly if you have young people and if you're interested in institutions, this is an invaluable conversation we're having right now, an intergenerational dialogue on HBCUs. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's pick up, if we can, with what we just heard. My brother Jelani Favors, Professor Favors, brother Jelani raised, and we heard the Billingsley's kind of sketch out in terms of this infusion of resources at HBCUs, particularly public HBCUs. Of course, the $577 million settlement in the Maryland lawsuit, and being kind of the one that's leading the news today, as it relates to what those resources can and should be devoted to at HBCUs and more. So back in a minute.
Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punches! I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table. When we left, we were in a conversation with Jelani Favors, Andrew Billingsley, Amy Billingsley, around the issue of resources for HBCUs and what that can translate into in terms of us being able to do more with more. So let's bring our conversants into the conversation again, and we'll kind of end today by raising this question. We all have seen the news. Dr. Billingsley, you mentioned the $577 million lawsuit that was settled in the state of Maryland, which is the latest in an iteration of legal warfare. I think about our friend Alvin Chambliss down in Mississippi, Ayers versus Fordyce from years ago, the Tennessee case, the Geyer case, where you see an attempt to get resources for public HBCUs at least. Harold Ford Jr., who's in the Tennessee legislature, saying that, this is the money that's owed to public HBCUs in Tennessee. And we've also seen in the wake of the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, this kind of racial reckoning, as it's been characterized, and a lot of foundation support. Ralph Lauren giving money, Disney talking about they giving money, people putting money in. How should those resources be deployed? And I want to tie that to, Jelani, with your discussion of the second curriculum and those master teachers who are versed the invisible. When universities get a windfall of resources, whether it be through foundation support or whether it be through private donations or even increased state funding, how should those resources be best deployed at HBCUs to support that second curriculum, this Black university concept, this excellence without white models concept? And we've also seen finally celebrity hires, so to speak. Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates at Howard. On the athletic side, Deion Sanders at Jackson State. What's the brother's name? Hugh Jackson at Grambling. Eddie George at Tennessee State. How best should we seize this moment now in terms of the future of HBCUs as it relates to resources? Y'all have some thoughts on that?
I do. I think it boils down to this question again, to the Nelsonian question, right? What do these spaces have to do with the liberation of Black people? I've said this over and over again in different spaces that I've been in talking about HBCUs. Black colleges have made incredible contributions to this country, culturally, socially, economically. But the most important contribution that Black colleges have made has been in the transformation of American democracy itself. These institutions, and Dr. Billingsleys have already raised the critical importance of the Black church, but these pillar institutions of the Black church and HBCUs have served as a catalyst for every major social movement in American history. And the power behind that was not only a second curriculum, it was the humanities and social sciences at these institutions. And we live in a moment where so much attention, even now with all of this windfall, as you classify it, of philanthropic support, and I say windfall with air quotes because, again, much of what's being given is still a drop in the bucket compared to what so many PWIs garner on a yearly basis in terms of financial support. But so much of this funding is going to propping up STEM programs. And again, as I often say in so many of these talks, this is not to denigrate the importance of STEM. We need Black folks in STEM, but we also need HBCUs to never forget the legacy of the humanities and social sciences and how it produced critical thinkers like the Billingsleys and others, who again, embrace sociology and history and political science and African-American studies. Black studies emerges in large part to so many of the intellectual traditions that were already going on within HBCU spaces. And so we want to continue to make HBCUs relevant for the 21st century and for a new generation, we have to find a way to reinvigorate the humanities and social sciences at HBCUs. I've been in conversation with my good friend, Dr. Melanie Price at Prairie View A&M, who left, just like myself, left Rutgers and went home to her alma mater, which is Prairie View. And now she is leading up the Ruth Simmons Center for Race and Social Justice. But Ruth Simmons is coming to Prairie View, and she gets it. She understands that there's a legacy, an intellectual tradition of producing radicalism and dissent that has questioned white supremacy in America. And the only way that we're going to continue that tradition is by funding the humanities and social sciences. So when she opens up her Rolodex, she's calling friends not to say, hey, write us a $500,000 check for this new engineering program. We want you to fund these centers for race and social justice. We want you to fund the arts and the humanities and social sciences at these institutions, because they are just as vitally important, if not more vitally important, to the legacy and tradition of what these institutions have done in reshaping the social and political contours of America. So if we want a new generation of young Black people to come through these spaces, and again, if you want to go into STEM, you want to go to engineering and computer sciences, that's fine. But you also need to understand the legacy of racial responsibility. You also need to understand the legacy of countering and questioning white supremacy wherever you find it. You know, no matter what boardroom you're in, or no matter what classroom you happen to come into, right? You need to have the mental fortitude and the intellectual skills to be able to articulate and call out white supremacy and racist thinking, and to question it, and to an attempt to try to radically redefine these spaces. And I think that's what HBCUs have been about, and the humanities and social sciences have been a large part of that. And so we need to find a way to spread that funding into those spaces if we want to continue to see these institutions serving the vital role that they have played in the past.
Thank you, brother. And we're going to give the last word to the Billingsleys, and perhaps we can use it to walk across to you all the bridge that that Professor Favors just built, in part by evoking the name of Ruth Simmons, a true academic who led Ivy League institutions, of course, that daughter of the South, who's gone to Prairie View and modeled for us again in the great tradition of the Mary Bethunes and the Benjamin Mazes, and some of that from our generation who have tried to aspire to that, like a Walter Kimbrough at Dillard. The idea that HBCU leadership, administrative leadership, should have a deep intellectual foundation, one that transcends this kind of profit motive driven labor market, job market driven attitude toward HBCUs. So with that in mind, as two educators and institution builders who absolutely had and have that foundation and framework, any thoughts on the future of HBCUs from where you all sit? I'm not gonna let y'all retire, so I'm just so go ahead.
I think, Greg, that in looking toward the future, we should always try to build it in recognition of the past. I mean, after the end of slavery, who would have thought that there were Black men and women later who could lead states, whole states? My work in South Carolina, I mean, for a dozen years, you know, there was Black leadership of the whole state. They didn't have to go in school to learn that. They learned it by living. And when we started Black studies programs at white universities in 68, 69, the model already existed. There were already Black colleges teaching about Black people, Black history, about Africa, about Du Bois, about Fraser, and so on, and so on. So we need to look at these institutions not only as underfunded, underdeveloped, under whatever, but as pioneers, as leaders, in setting forth new ways of looking at the African American experience and at the experience of African Americans in the country and in the world at large.
Thank you, Dr. Andrew Billingsley. Professor Amy Billingsley, do you have any final comments before we? And by the way, don't sleep on that Alfred Street HBCU fair. It's the country's largest. If you young people don't know about that, maybe even help us understand for young people how they can become a part of that annual fair as well, if you don't mind, in addition to whatever else you have on your mind.
Okay. I think it happens in February,
yes.
And it's a matter of just joining it. You can go on the website and get information about how to be in touch with it. But it's incredible how much you can learn from HBCUs and what HBCUs have to offer, which to me reminds me that one of the big advantages of HBCUs is they don't just take the cream of the crop. They take some very important people who maybe haven't even learned to read. Some of them, their parents have not learned to read. And they are able to educate those people and bring them up to do important things. Like Ruth Simmons, for example. She grew up as a sharecropper, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
And she was one of 18 family members, 18 children, and she has done incredible things. So they're just very important aspects of all ranges of our Black community. Here at my son's house, they're working, I think thanks to the history makers in part, but they're working on a lot of different ways of understanding the Black experience. And he's working on Virginia Beach. They have the churches put in 5 cents, 10 cents, 20 cents, different small amounts of money in order to start schools because they felt education was so important. So it's just, I think that our people have just done some amazing things, and it's so important that we're now getting our lion is now getting our story out.
Yes. That's a perfect way to pause, as you say, Professor Billingsley. Until lions have historians, the hunters will always be heroes. So finally, the lions are getting the story out, and the Black Table is one of those spaces. Thank you again, two legends, Andrew and Amy Billingsley. One of our master teachers in our generation, Brother Jelani Favors, and like Brother Jelani and me, the HBCUs took us in. So we're going to do our best to continue to look back as we go forward. And this isn't the end of this conversation. This is just a pause in this moment of the Black Table, but we certainly want to invite you all back because we've picked so many topics. And thank you all so much for joining us. I will end with this. This is our inaugural convening of the Black Table. And as I said at the beginning of this, our objective is to help broaden these conversations, create a different kind of lens, and leave us with different ways of thinking so that we can have different ways of moving and acting through the world. Thank you to the entire staff at Black Star Network and to everyone who is participating in this. And this is what independent Black media looks like. So support us, and we'll see you all next time around the Black Table.